Dengerin lagu terbaru saya, I Just Wanna Love You, di playlist Indonesia Terbaik.
Yeah.
Introduce myself first. My name is Arif from SDG Center of Pajajaran University. I am forced to be the master of ceremony for this very good morning. Welcome to Bandung. I know that it took a lot of effort for you guys to come here. I do apologize, but I promise you it's worth it. So, Bandung is a very nice city. It's totally, more preferable than doing it in Jakarta. By the way, so because we came early, so I think maybe it's better for us to start early because everyone is here, and I think we will have more time later for Q&A. So because I see from the agenda that we don't have much time for that, so starting early is good. Yeah? So let me begin by let us begin this morning by two opening remarks. One is opening remark by the co-host of the event, which is Professor Armida Alisabana, the director of SDG Center Unpad, and then later on will be by Professor Hee Jin Lee, the president of KAIDEC. So I invite Ibu Profesor Armida to give a welcoming remark. Kami sir, Ibu, silakan.
Very good morning to all of you. Ibu Kerry, Vice Rector Universitas Pajajaran, Professor Hee Jin Lee, President of KAIDEC, Korea Association of International Development and Cooperation, colleagues, participants of the third International Symposium on Asian Development Studies. So on behalf of SDG Center Universitas Pajajaran, I would like to warmly welcome all of you to Bandung. I'm sure several of you is the first time you visit Bandung, whereas several of you also already visited Bandung before. And this symposium, as initiated by KAIDEC, aims to discuss the Asian development issues and challenges and how best to find solutions in a comprehensive manner. So this is a very timely initiatives. And as I understand that this is the third initiative, last year and the previous years we also already held a symposium on topics also related to Asian development challenges and issues. I would like to especially thank KAIDEC, President Hee Jin Lee, as well as Korea Foundation for this opportunity to cooperate together to co-host this very important event. On the theme of this year's symposium, which is a very particular theme, actually, we would like to highlight the theme of partnership and engagement, the roles of state and non-state actors in addressing inequality. So in this symposium, if we look at the program, there are maybe three main issues, topics that we would like to discuss together. First is on the Asian development challenges and issues in a more broad manner. Second, SDGs related issues in which inequality is part of that. And third is on the specific issue related to partnership and engagement, especially the roles of state and non-state actors. And I believe not only in addressing inequality, but also in addressing the very broad development challenges, especially within the Asian context. So I think this would be very interesting. And we have managed to assemble quite a diverse topic as well as expert and expertise within our 1.5 day meeting. So I hope this event will be very very enrichful to all of us, so we can share our our expertise, experiences, our research, as well as lessons learned, yeah, not only on the conventional approach, yeah, to development, but also the innovative, more creative way, yeah, to approach this issue in order for us to accelerate the realization, if I may, yeah, relate that to SDGs. And now about our center, yeah, when some of you just arrived and had the opportunity to have a light chat with me, yeah, several of you already asked about this SDG Center. SDG Center was established last year, so it's still a baby maybe, still a baby. It was established May 2016 in response, yeah, of SDGs commitment of everybody in the world, yeah, including Indonesia, including our university, yeah. And SDG Center is under the guidance of our president, our university president, rector, is a center of excellence, yeah, at the university level, meaning it is multidisciplinary in nature, multi-sectoral in its approach, yeah. But of course, yeah, this is still 1-2 years in our initial activities. What I can share with you is that our focus is first, of course, research, yeah, because we are university research on SDGs related topic. Our flagship research that we are doing now, and we already produced one book, yeah, is on the baseline studies of provinces in Indonesia. Not only baseline per se as such, yeah, but we also try to project, yeah, based on the business as usual scenario towards 2030. Of course, selected indicators, yeah, selected indicators of all the pillars of 17 almost, yeah, of the SDGs indicators. We already have the result, provincial level, when in fact, yeah, during our 60th anniversary of our university, we already submitted the book to President Jokowi, yeah. It's quite interesting, yeah, the result. And then we are going into more detail to the provincial level in cooperation with Jawa Barat province, yeah, and then also to the district level. For example, with UNDP, we just signed an MOU, and we are going to go down to the district level for one province, in which the Lampung province, and so on. Yeah, we hope to continue the activity, and then cluster topics related research. Of course, SDGs. Yeah. For example, just to give you 1 or 2 examples, poverty and inequality. Headed, of course, by our colleague, yeah, who is an expert in this area, Pak Arif and Ansori Yusuf. And in this topic, we have cooperation, yeah, with King's College. We set up a part of a set up of an international network, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, global network on poverty and inequality dynamics, yeah, Pak Arif, yeah, with King College and several others, our colleagues, yeah, from across several countries. Another example of the cluster-related research topics that we are doing now is green accounting, but relate that, I don't know, maybe several of you are familiar with EEA, System of Integrated Environmental Economic Accounting, and then ecological environmental account, yeah, and then we try to link that with how it can benefit, yeah, into the formulation of SDG indicators. Yeah, that's the second example. And third example, we are also doing something, yeah, on sustainable cities and sustainable infrastructure, with example of Kota Bandung, our city, yeah. As maybe some of you know that our mayor is quite innovative, yeah, one of the leader in the country in terms of innovation and so on and so forth. So therefore, we also have some research and already 1-2 publication, yeah, with the mayor as one of the co-author. So that is just just example of what we are doing. Aside from training, we are in partnership with Environmental Economic Institute of Indonesia, yeah, the partner institution of IPSI. With EEII, we are conducting trainings such as environmental evaluation, things like that. Yeah. So again, those are just to share with you several of our activities, and we hope, yeah, not only we are co-hosting this very important symposium, I'm sure in the near future we can have common mutual, yeah, interest in furthering our cooperation in the related research or other activities. Again, thank you very much for your participation, and I hope, yeah, although the time is quite limited, you will also have the time to enjoy our beautiful city of Bandung. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibu Armida. Before we come to the next remark, I also like to let you know that we are live, actually, streaming. And if any of you have social media account, Facebook, Twitter, or things like that, I invite you to share to your friends, colleagues, that they can also live view this event fully for the 1.5 day. And also, we will have also record. So for each paper, we will have separate videos. So we will have 12 videos that we can publish later on in our website and in KAIDEC website, I think. So now let's begin. Let's come to the opening remark from President of KAIDEC, Professor Hee-Jin Lee.
Good morning. I'm Hee-Jin. Thank everyone for coming on time. Actually, some of us had a long and winding journey, including me yesterday, and arrived very late. And despite the long journey and the tiring day, we start even earlier than scheduled. So it shows our passion for the event, and most of all, it shows our partnership and engagement. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues, and the Vice Rector of the University for Research, Dr. Kerry Lestari, and Professor Amida Alija-Spana. I am pleased to welcome you all to the third International Symposium on Asian Development Studies. On behalf of KAIDEC, I thank all those involved for making this wonderful event possible. My special thanks goes to the Korea Foundation for its generous support in a row for 3 years. KAIDEC has been running this symposium on Asian development studies since 2015 with the recognition that we Asians should lead discourses on development taking place in our region. KAIDEC practices, theories, and the challenges regarding development in Asia should be discussed and can be better addressed by researchers, academics, and practitioners, and policymakers who are situated in the local. For this year's symposium, we have chosen a theme: partnership and engagement, the roles of state and non-state actors in addressing inequality. As research and reality show, the dilemma of development is that it always comes with inequality. Although inequality is concerned with all areas of development, SDG number 10 specifies reducing inequalities because equality is the essence of development, to my understanding. All the efforts to reduce the inequalities require partnership among all the players surrounding development activities. In particular, partnership between state and non-state actors on the one hand and engagement by each other are key aspects for partnership. As Asia goes on the development path, the issue of equality and inequality gets more complicated and the interactions between state and the non-state actors could be more sensitive and controversial. Therefore, it is right time, I believe, that we dealt with the challenges surrounding partnership in addressing inequality. A glance through the list of presentation for the next 2 days reveals the amazing diversity and the insight from the participants, practices, and the theoretical reflections. Symposiums like this provide a valuable opportunity for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to share our experiences, which has generally lacked in the Asian context. I believe this is one of the significant contributions we could make as a community. I am grateful to all the participants who have come to share their knowledge. I am sure you will have fruitful and rewarding exchanges today and tomorrow, not only in the formal event, but also through diverse networking opportunities. I wish you every success with this important symposium, and I look forward myself to learning from all of us. Before I close, I'd like to thank again SDG Center, Universitas Padjadjaran, for hosting the symposium, and those involved in preparation for the event for their effort, especially Arif and Juji and Wandi on the Indonesian side, and Professor Moon, our international chair, and Miss Gang Shim, who's come from Korea, not in this room. Where is she? Please remind her I mentioned her. And there's another lady, the Kim Min-jin, Miss Kim Min-jin, who hasn't come, but she is the one of the key persons who made this event possible. Even in running a small event, by small I don't mean to belittle their effort, but compared to the goal of MDG, this is just one of the small event. Even in running a small event like this, the partnership and the engagement are essential. I hope and strongly believe that the spirit of partnership and engagement shared among us as the community of Asian development studies will keep going for the next year's event and for the sustainability of our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we would like to invite Ibu Dr. Kerry Lestari, Vice Rector of Universitas Pelajaran, representing the President of the University. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Arif. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good morning for all of you. President of KAIDEC, Professor Hijin Lee, good morning. Director of SDG Center, Prof. Arbida Ali Sahbana, selamat pagi Ibu. Executive Director SDG Center, Professor Arif Ansori, and all the staff and all the professors who will attending this symposium and participant of the International Symposium of Asian Development Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in Universitas Padjadjaran, especially in Unpad Training Center here. Here is one of the training center of Unpad in Bandung. And on behalf of Rector Universitas Padjadjaran, I convey my warmest welcome to all of you to attend the event of the third International Symposium of Asian Development Studies with the theme of the partnership and engagement role of state and non-state actors in addressing inequality in Unpad Training Center Bandung. It is a great pleasure to have you here in Bandung City. People say that it is the flower city of Bandung, or this is the Paris Panjava. It's a historical city because in 1955, Bandung has the event for the independence of the many country in the world, especially in Asia, Africa country. And then I hope if you have time, although the time is limited here, maybe the committee can bring the participant to have the historical walk in Asia, Africa building in Gedung Merdeka. We call it Gedung Merdeka, or in English is the Independence Building. That is the historical. In 1955, all the head of the state is attend the conference of Afro-Asia Conference in 1955. And also Unpad is name, the Pajajaran is taken from the name of the king of Sunda in the Sundanese area here. So we are established in 1957, so we are 60 years old, quite old now. And then in last September, we already has inaugurated our university. Now, right now, Unpad has 60 faculty. It belongs to the health science, social science, economic science, law science, and then also the literacy, and then the communication. And with almost 14,000 students, so quite huge students. And for almost 3 years, we have becoming the most favorite university in the country from the student who has the higher education. And with the rank of the Asian rank established by the QS Star, we are now in 1.5% best university in Asia. In Asia has almost 12,000 university, and then in the 12,000 university, Unpad include in 1.5 best university. 1.5% best university in Asia. And then relating to the theme of the symposium, I would also like to emphasize our university development policy, that Unpad has the good collaboration with the government in West Java. We already have the tagline from West Java for Indonesia to the world through Sustainable Development Goals. Then I have also that this is the Unpad has the education entity expected to provide significant benefit to sustainable economic development. The theme of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, all the goals is 70 goals, is already included in our curriculum. So we think that nowadays our students is become leaders for the future. So our students need to know how to emphasize the thing of the sustainable in arrange or the development in the human being. So that's why the SDGs goals is already include in our curriculum and deliver in the first years of the students' curriculum. And then one of the Unpad important program in supporting innovation development is improves the facilities and quantity of the research activities. And then one of the center for the research activities, we have the Sustainable Development Goals Center. It is that already has the cooperation with the KAIDEC, and today has the event for this symposium, International Symposium in Asian Development Study. We see that the addressing inequality is get along with the spirit of the SDGs, that try from the SDGs has the spirit is no one left behind. So the issue of the addressing inequality was one of the most important issue from the SDGs rather than MDGs. For this coming trip, I would like to express my sincerely thanks to the President of the KAIDEC, Professor Hei-Jin Lee. Thank you for the good cooperation. Now we have the third event, so this is the sustainable event also. And then, for the Director of SDGs Center Unpad, Professor Armida Ali Sahbana, and all the members of the SDG Center, and all the dedicated colleagues who have the work very hard to ensure the success of this event. And also for the participants participated in the workshop and the symposium, I wish the event has a great success and all guests and participants find a most rewarding and enjoyable time in Bandung. Thank you for the kind attention, and then we hope we have the enjoyable event here. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
The other agenda before we begin is actually group photo, but before then there's another agenda that we should do, which is very important, the signing of the MOU between SDG Center and KAIDEC. And I would like to invite Professor Hei-Jin Lee and Ibu Armida Sabana to come forward to do the signing. Maybe you don't need this thing. Yeah. Sit, maybe sit.
This chair is.
Traditional because of the mask.
Okay, thank you. So let's. I would like to invite everyone to come forward. So we have a group photo first because I'm worried that some of us will leave later on. So.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. And smile. 3, 2, 1. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we will start 10 or 10 to 10 minutes. Wah, itu bisa dibuka kan, kopi? Bisa. Yeah, sekalian. We are preparing some table here for the Q&A. So we have a break for 10 minutes, and then please have a coffee there already ready for you. There is some snacks, and just feel free to.
Good morning. Just listening to opening remarks, I'm fully convinced that I should be glad I came over to join this worthy joint venture after 7 hours of flight and 5 hours of land transportation. It's worth it. As a first speaker, the most important thing that I have to remember is to exercise self-control so that I wouldn't go beyond the allocated assigned time of 15 minutes. Okay. But let me start with my expression first of my respect to Unpad for having established SDG Center here. This might not be the one and only SDG Center on the globe, on the planet, but Unpad certainly marked its place on the global map as its host of SDG Center. And second, my respect and gratitude to both organizers of this symposium, Unpad SDG Center and KAIDEC. And thirdly, my gratitude to KAIDEC for the kind invitation to two of us Japanese as representatives of Japan Society for Japan Society for International Development. And we have had collaboration exchange over the past 6 years. The exchange started when my colleague from JASID, Kan Sato, was the president of JASID, and we have had this exchange over the past 6 years, and this time I'm grateful to be able to participate in the KAIDEC co-sponsored event, and 고맙습니다. Okay, let me start my presentation. First of all, as a Japanese, I have to start my talk with an apology. And in my case, it's a sincere, genuine apology. I changed the title of my presentation, okay? And I got the impression that for some of you here in Indonesia, East Asia signifies Northeast Asia, rather than Northeast and Southeast Asia included. Maybe it varies, maybe it's understood, but anyway. So I changed East Asia in my original title into Southeast Asia, okay? And then I added, oh, it's there, okay? And beyond. Since I decided to look at some, what I consider as relevant and important experiences from outside Southeast Asia, from outside broader East Asia. Okay? And I hope that reference would serve the purpose of the conference. Let me start. So, I'm supposed to help myself. Okay. So, you are familiar with this and 2 pledges in the 2030 agenda: leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first. And these 2 pledges certainly pass warm heart test or idealism test, yes. But how about cool head test or realism test? Okay. And some of you here might remember one legislation in US Congress back in 2001 titled No Child Left Behind Act. At least somebody from US should remember that. No Child Left Behind Act. 50 years on, what is the reality? Okay? So we really should be idealistic, coming up with global agenda and declarations. But I hope this is research center, so there is play some room and role for realism as well. Okay. So next. Okay, so this is how my presentation is structured. First, introduction. Second, sort of the glasses I wear to look at the real world. And 2, early childhood development. That is the issue focus in my presentation and concluding remarks. Question and focus. Perpetuation of inequality, either in the sense of intragenerational continuation of inequality, intergenerational transmission. And conceptually, this has to be explicit. This will have to come up sooner or later. Inequality of outcomes as against inequality of opportunity. Better be explicit upfront. Okay? And the theme of this symposium, public and private actions. Okay, this is my conceptual setup. Okay? And first, gradient versus deviance, sort of way of looking at the reality and come up with the policy program approach. And I will focus on going back to these pledges, reaching the furthest behind first. And this is literally outreach. Okay? And as I sort of hinted, it's easier said than done. So I'll discuss the various questions involved in service transactions and typical failures that happen to occur in service relationships. Okay? And here I put typically when you speak of service, the sort of immediate notion is that of service delivery. And that is supply dominant perspective. I'll pay more attention to the relationship and user side, since what it matters is whether service is taken up and utilized. Okay? Being delivered is just reaching the service to the sort of to the door. Okay? So this is the gradient and deviance. Typically, you are interested in whatever outcome, and you put that variable on the vertical axis. Okay? Be it child nutrition status, whatever. Then on the horizontal axis, you put what you consider as a determining variable, be it household income, be it mother's education status. And typically, you see the positive sort of gradient. Higher the household income, on the average, higher the children's nutritional status, and so on. Okay? But you also see deviance from that tendency, both positive deviation and negative deviation, given the level of the determining factor, right? Given the family is equally poor, but nutritional status of children shows deviance. Okay? Some are higher than average, some are lower than average. And so when you think of policy programs, you can take deviance approach and try to increase the level of the determining factor, thereby improving the outcome on average. Or you take that determining factor as given and try to see whether what sort of message, what sort of lessons you can learn from the positive deviant cases, and try to see whether that could be transferred to negative deviant cases, so that negative deviant performance could be uplifted to the level of positive deviance cases. Okay, this is service transaction. As I said, I pay more attention, put more emphasis on uptake of services and utilization of services. And this is if you are interested in this part of my talk, this source, Pritchett and Woolcock 2004 World Development article, is worth your reading. But anyway, classification of services, and the most significant services tend to have two characteristics: transaction intensive and discretionary. And they, Pritchett and Woolcock, call that type of service as practice. Okay? So in education, classroom teaching, transaction intensive and discretionary. In health, clinical consultation, transaction intensive and discretionary. Then I have added my comments to their original explanation, characterization of transaction intensity and discretionary character of certain types of services. And to me, they are still operating in the mode of supply-dominant service delivery mode of thinking. Therefore, I added perspectives from interactive nature as well as user emphasis perspective of service transaction. I put at least equal emphasis on the role of users. And conceptually, I also explore the link between the discretionary character and transaction intensity character of service transactions, leading to the formulation of conjectures on two types of failures in typical practice type services. Okay? And when you emphasize the user side, these considerations, agency, empowerment, motivation, come to figure centrally in the discussion of service uptake and service utilization. Okay, these are another typology in terms of user-provider relationships. All of you have received at least the electronic version, right, of the presentation. And so if you're interested, you can print them out and read at your leisure, okay? So, as I said, outreach. If you are serious about leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first, you are talking about outreach, the most difficult task in service transactions, since there's no transaction to start with, okay? And it involves lots of user agency. And it's tend to fail, okay? Two types of failures. Okay, substance of the question, early childhood development. Oh, I skipped one slide. And there is PD, positive deviance approach, intervention in Vietnam on childhood malnutrition. There was USAID funded sort of pilot in 2003 to 2008 in Indonesia. And recommendation was made to Ministry of Health. That's the end of the story. I haven't heard from anybody since on whatever happened or whatever failed to happen on that recommendation. But anyway, there was pilot at least in Indonesia. Then sanitation and hygiene. This, of course, is not particular to early childhood. This is more general. And yet, there is an important link between sanitation, hygiene, and malnutrition. And let me just try to pronounce the technical term that describes this situation. Okay, be ready. I could mispronounce it. Environmental enteropathy. And sort of in everyday language, it's leaky gut syndrome. That is, you might take as much food, as much nutrients as needed, and yet your gut, your digestive absorptive system could fail to take in to your system the nutrients. Therefore, you end up in the situation of malnutrition. Okay? And this is supposed to be very big factor in early childhood malnutrition. And this is a very recent focus. Okay? So in that connection, the sanitation and hygiene is also relevant, in particular for early childhood development. Again, if you are interested in any part of my presentation, please consult my paper. I hope it's also available. Is it? Papers are distributed?
In Dropbox.
Oh, okay. Okay. And it's readable, I hope.
You have the sign there.
Time's up. That means I'm done. Okay, final part.
It needs to be bigger because some of our eyesight not very good.
Our vision is selective. I don't see anything in red. Thank you very much.
Oh, extra.
Okay, no. And So I'm sorry. Let me mention the Beyond Asia part at least before I skip them. At least mention them. Okay. First is this is Lancet. Are you familiar with this medical journal? They are serving as a sort of, what shall I call it, sounding board of the international endeavor. Okay, they are not narrow academic journal. Okay, so this is literally state of the art. Okay, I believe Lancet is accessible free. At least this issue, 2006 feature on early childhood, is freely accessible. Okay, then Jamaica study. Look at the date, mid-80s, and yet this is full-fledged randomized control experiment, test, okay? And follow-up over 20 years, okay? So, and the emphasis, look at the design. It intervention in terms of good old nutrition to your body, yes, but intervention in terms of psychosocial stimulation. It's a sort of nutrition to your heart, to your mind. And the finding is really nutrition to your heart and mind is more effective than nutrition to your body in child growing up and lead a more sound human life later in life. Okay? Then this is from USA. Thank you. Nurse family partnership. And this focus is here more on mothers rather than children, since obviously as a living environment of young children, families, but oftentimes families are important, but oftentimes families are broken, non-existent. So focus is high-risk, vulnerable young mothers. Okay? And full-fledged agency development program over the course of first 1,000 days of the child, starting from the pregnancy and covering first 2 years of baby's life. And similar design in Chile Solidario. This is government program. The Nurse Family Program partnership is private, non-profit operation. Okay? Comparison. In the case of Nurse Family Partnership, predetermined workload and very effective supervision and voluntary participation of the mothers. Chile Solidario, it's a government policy. It has to cover all the eligible families. Therefore, sometimes excessive workload for especially working with families who have tremendous difficulties. So this is a case of trying to outreach to the farthest behind. Okay? And in the case of Chile Solidario, it didn't quite work. There were all the good intentions, serious political commitment. It didn't work. Okay, let me go through very quickly. Oh, sorry.
You have to wrap up.
Yes, I am. In my -1 minute, let me wrap up. Okay? So if you are serious about two pledges of SDG, praxis type or transaction intensive and discretionary kind of service are essential. Social services are essential. But they are very, very susceptible to failures. Then this has to set the constraint on sort of reality check on the idealism. Okay? Let me finish here. Thank you very much, and I'll be looking forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Toru Yanagihara. We can understand, because so much, that we would like to share and present, because of this important topic, and also we have the benefit because one presenter could not come, and also we started early, so we have extra time, Julie.
Don't say that.
All right, So I hope, the next presenter could allocate their time. Maximum 20 minutes is fine. We still have ample time for discussion. I would like now to invite Pak Denison Jayasuriya, on SDGs B40. I'm not sure what is B40, and addressing inequality among urban poor flat dwellers in Malaysia. Time is yours.
Selamat pagi dan salam sejahtera. Good morning to all, and thank you for this invitation. Can I ask the lady at the back to come and sit in front? Kalau you duduk depan sini, semua boleh terang-terang nampak. Kalau tidak, jauh tak nampak. Okay. The theme that I'm taking on, in contrast to the first speaker that was much more comprehensive on methodology, mine and his application to various case studies on policy practice and the analysis that he used. Mine is direct to the theme of SDGs, bottom 40%, addressing inequality from an SDG perspective in the Malaysian context and narrowing it down to flat dwellers who are part of the bottom 40%. It has a practice component of gathering data from the ground, but it is more descriptive rather than analytical for this presentation within 15-20 minutes. I don't have a watch, so you need to warn me. So there are four parts to my presentation. It's high-rise living in the city of Kuala Lumpur, the SDG agenda of 2030 inequalities, linking it to the development planning of Malaysia, where we are at the 11th Malaysia Plan, and there are synergies to the 11th Plan and the SDGs, and then taking the specific neighborhoods and finally lessons learned in terms of the development model, the challenges, especially for stakeholder engagement that the SDG framework provides. Now, in terms of SDG and B40 concerns, the Agenda 2030 document has a whole comprehensive write-up before the 17 goals, 169 targets, and over 230 indicators. So the paragraphs are important in the preamble to the 17 goals, addressing not just poverty, but rising inequalities in society, which is different from the MDG target that was set earlier. So in paragraph 14, and then paragraph 34 with reference to sustainable urban development with the notion of cities that come in SDG 11, SDG 10 and 11. So the interlinkages are important between violence, insecurity to inequality, corruption, poor governance, illicit financing, arms flow. So it's a much more rigorous analysis to just poverty and lack of income, which the SDGs take up in its write-up. And then it brings the diverse actors, states, while they are responsible, civil society and grassroots movements have a role, and there is a key accountability process to citizens as a whole, and the SDG builds this. Now, the two guiding principles, their targets, their indicators that I've taken is reducing inequality, income growth for the B40 is something 10.1, but it's talking of inclusion of all in terms of social, economic, political inclusion. So SDGs bring the component of politics and human rights within the framework of inequalities, and it brings the theme of equal opportunities and also reducing inequality of outcomes in eliminating discrimination. So the document is quite strong in its human rights language, although many countries, including Malaysia, try to play down the human rights component. Social protection, greater equality is central. So when we look at SDG 11, which is the theme of next year's high-level political forum, the focus is on resilient cities, not only safe, but resilient, able to come back from poverty or risk, high risk of income gap and all. So housing, transportation, public space becomes quite central to the whole discourse of inequalities, and not just income. So it's closer to Amartya Sen's development as freedom paradigm, as opposed to just GDP, GNI measurements. So in the Malaysia plan, two key concepts interplay in the sort of discussion. One is inclusive development. It's not just a cliche, but its inclusivity is key to ensure every citizen. This is a problem in the Malaysian context. It's not consistent to SDG because national priorities are to citizens, SDG is to human beings. So migrant workers, refugees, undocumented people, all become central to leaving no one behind. But our development policy targets only governments. So it'll be useful to look at other ASEAN countries. But it's looking at, regardless of gender, ethnicity, socio-economic status, geographical location, it's building on well-being, quality of life, and the multi-dimensional is clear. It's moved beyond income, basket of goods, measurement, minimum $1 or $2 to much more to relative poverty measurements, because overall the region has grown tremendously, and so well-being, others use happiness index and things like that, but well-being, the Malaysian government focus is four-dimensional, moving beyond income to health, education, living conditions, and there are various indicators that fall short of the SDGs, but it's better than the basket of goods measurement which was used previously. Now, in terms of the targets and directions, before we come to its applications to flat dwellers, the 11th plan highlights 2.7 million people in the B40. Malaysian population is small comparison to Indonesia or other parts of the world, but B40 with an income of a household income of 2,537, now it's been readjusted to above 3,000 ringgit, which is much higher than the $1 or $2 that's set at the SDG level, might be higher than other countries in the region. But government action is developed quite systematically to inclusiveness, equitable, moving the household income through micro businesses, skills training, raising income levels and wealth. So it's moved beyond income to asset management, house, investments, those kind, and ability of savings measurement. Also increased addressing cost of living, enhancing delivery to the bottom 40%. Now, the field study that I did is a bigger study with a particular focus of more than 30 neighborhoods around the country, but I've just picked 6. In my abstract, I said 10, but I cut one area out to just cover the city of Kuala Lumpur because it's easier for description and the time. So Malaysia saw rapid urbanization in the post-1970 period, and especially during the premiership of Dr. Tun Dr. Mahathir. And it saw the massive move from rural to urban, agriculture to manufacturing, to industries, big industries, and the shift as well as from agriculture away from rubber to oil palm, and that affected. KL is still small compared to Jakarta or some of the other cities. It's about less than 2 million people. But the overall urban population in Malaysia is now something like 70, reaching 80% of the country. It can be regarded as urbanized and modernized in that context. So the housing situation early was quarters, unorganized housing without water, electricity. But in the last 10 years, whole neighborhoods and townships developed for the bottom 40%, which is between 4 stories to 21 stories, either rental flats or flats that people could purchase at a low level through a means test that is available closer to transportation, city, and other sorts. Now, looking at the 6 neighborhoods of the B40, which comes to almost 20,000 people living in the different neighborhoods, we undertook what is called a simple community profile rather than door-to-door survey using either key informers or focus groups or existing data that the residents associations had. Focus group, field visits, and interaction with grassroots organizations and groups in all the 6 areas. Actually, I visited all the others as well. So this is one of the flats, Sri Samara flats, and each of the flats would have neighborhood committee, either it's a resident, security committee of some kind of people living in that area, and we had interaction. This is Kampong Baru, and you see the disparities. This is just at the Twin Towers, where you have this 17-story flats in a place called Kampong Baru, which is, Kampong means village, but it's at the foot of the Twin Towers, and the kind of interaction in the communities that are multi-ethnic, Malay, Muslim, Hindu, Indians, and other communities. Now, from the feedback, because all of them are in the bottom, less than 3,000 ringgit, but they are above the poverty line in the bottom 40 categories. And the common issues that they are facing in the struggle to better quality and the kind of deprivation they are experiencing. So they're not in starvation, but they're experiencing some forms of deprivation. So I've divided it into 4 areas: socio-economic, crime-related, infrastructure, participation issues, because it's state actors and non-state actors. So socio-economic, urban poverty, space for micro business. I think sometimes Jakarta is more friendly for small businesses. Myanmar is very friendly to the informal sector selling in front of shops and all. In other more organized ways, licensing, formalization displaces the informal, especially women selling cakes or drinks or things like that for health and other factors. Daycare centers in the neighborhood itself so that women could work and care. Crime related seem to be high. This is a carryover, let's say even Chicago, New York, London, inner city areas see, Paris sees this in terms of drugs, alcohol, safety, security, social issues. LEPA is a word for youth loafing, gangs, real gangs, guns, knives, which we call parang, sort of threats. Infrastructure is a major issue. Lifts, cleanliness, garbage, waste management, which is part of SDG goals of managing the urban space. Public facilities, community, places to bury the dead or have a funeral, cultural programs, multi-religious sensitivities, parking issues, vandalism. But one of the key areas is participation. To what extent, unlike rural, are they participating, busy at work, issues of social cohesion? And finally, governance related. Malaysia doesn't have a system of local government elections. Our mayors are not elected, not like the difficulties you went through in Jakarta recently for your mayor or your governors. Ours are all appointed by the politicians who are in control at the decision making. Dialogue sessions with the public sector is not regular. No formal grievance mechanisms. Local community empowerment is weak. And these are some of the points that people have raised. Now, there are a number of new initiatives on the ground, which is linked to, in Malay, a program Sayangi Community, which is Love Your Neighborhood, adopted by one of the departments in the Prime Minister's department to sort of engage more with the grassroots in identification of the issues and the potential solutions for neighborhood collective action in improving the quality of life at the ground in closer compliance to SDG 10 and 11 are some of the things that are emerging. And budget is provided, some kind of identification and solutions using the existing mechanism for participation. I draw 10 lessons from this analysis of policy, practice, gaps, and things like that. One is that the multidimensional nature of poverty, inequality, and things has emerged. This is more consistent to SDGs in an interrelation. You cannot just look at education without looking cross-cutting and so forth. That's come out very strongly from our study in the nature of problem. You can't tackle crime without tackling family or so forth. So that second is grassroots people know the issues, but empowerment to change it seems more difficult. Politicians are reluctant to empower grassroots communities. They prefer top-down and handout as opposed to people taking control and deciding what development should take place. And this is the contestation because all these neighborhoods voted for the opposition and not the current ruling government. And the other is, of course, grassroots leaders have good potential, but they need to be respected. Their voices need to be heard. In formal democracy, this is normal. I think whether you talk in the Philippines or there are others from Australia, but in democracies of certain ASEAN countries, voice and critical and alternative opinion is actually quite sensitive. You can end up in jail or you can get arrested or somebody might come after you and threaten you or your family. Governance must shift from top down to bottom up, identification, monitoring, implementation, especially to address inequalities in the urban area. Citizens' action that SDGs focus on for accountability is key. A rights-based approach to development, providing voice, is essential. Ensuring participation of all, women, women, as well as ethnic minorities is key. I notice there's now 2 minutes. And then as we come down, fostering a sense of belonging is critical. Because of urbanization, the formation of community is new. Now, we are actually going back to earlier work on social work, community development, building, social preparation of communities, because the urbanization was so rapid, and the formation of these flat communities, and many within the Malaysian community are not traditional livers on the sky. We are much more on the ground, no? In kampongs and estates and villages. So this kind of thing is quite necessary. And coming to social cohesion and social mobility, which is moving them up to the middle 40%, is critical. That's the end. You can follow me on Facebook, or you can follow our Malaysian SDG alliance that I'm part of that has some of these initiatives. But the key is hearing the voices at the bottom, us documenting it, and creating structures of engagement that is much more concrete. Those are under threat, voice, space for interaction. But with that, the belief and the correlation is improved quality of life and accountability in terms of taxpayers' funds and resources. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih. Thank you very much, Pak Dennis Jaya Surya. Very interesting presentation, yeah, on how to uplift the bottom 40%, especially related to the urban poor. Although I noticed that the criteria is quite high, yeah. 3,000 ringgit, yeah. 3,000 ringgit, yeah. Very high, yeah. Let's move on to the next presenter, Professor Ian Coxhead. The title of which is Must Try Harder, the Market for Skills and Economic Inequality, okay, Indonesia and Vietnam. Time is yours.
Thank you, Anita. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. I always know when I'm in the tropics because I feel colder than anywhere else. This room is... I have 20 minutes. That's like speed dating in academic terms. And since I'm very rusty at dating of any kind, forgive me if I sometimes go a little too fast. So I work on labor market issues in developing Southeast Asia. I'm going to talk today mostly about Vietnam, a little bit about Indonesia. And the point of this talk is to think about the interactions between educational goals and educational decisions made especially by poor people in these two countries. So let me say a little bit about what I mean. We're all familiar with the idea of a middle income trap. I think that term is overused. I think of the challenge of progressing through middle income. And we know that sustaining economic growth through middle income requires enormous investments in education and the application of that investment to productive activities. Those are significant challenges. Most of the policy responses to those challenges take the form of supply-side interventions. That is, building more schools, making schools better, improving teacher training, improving teacher incentives, so improving the supply of education in general. We also know that as incomes grow, parents want to invest in their children's education because education is a good thing. So even if they don't think about the economic implications, growth in income improves educational opportunities. So these two things, supply-side investments by the state and then investments by parents, are both going to promote more education in the society as a whole. Consequence of that, Indonesia and Vietnam in particular show enormous progress in achieving what was the old Millennium Development Goal of universal primary education. The new SDG goal of moving this up to really 12 years of education for everyone is a much bigger challenge, and we'll see in a moment from the data that progress in moving children from 9th grade to 12th grade and then on to tertiary education as well is much more difficult, or is proving a very big challenge. So the real question I want to ask is, what will keep kids in school through 9th grade, beyond 9th grade, and even perhaps into tertiary education? What is the sort of big picture story that relates to that? This is I think I want to point out that this is a kind of an interesting problem in terms of the theme of this conference, because we have two very big institutions, one mostly state institution, that's the education system, and one mostly non-state institution, that's the labor market, interacting. And so thinking about how these two sets of institutions engage through the decision to supply and demand more education is really one of the key interfaces between state and non-state institutions in the countries that we're thinking about. Okay, so very, very quickly some data. These are data which end, each of these lines ends in 2010. They're international educational attainment data. So the beginning points are different for every country. They're all lined up to begin at a point when per capita income was approximately the same or comparable across all of the countries. So we have very long lines for countries like South Korea, Malaysia, much shorter lines for countries like China and Vietnam, because they began poorer, they began growing much later. But the vertical axis shows us average years of education in the population as of 2010. It changed since then somewhat. And you can see Indonesia down the bottom here. Which one is the pointer? That one? Yeah. Indonesia down here. In 2010, a little bit over 6 years of education on average. Vietnam, the other country I'm looking at, also just a little over 6 years of education at the point that they'd reached in 2010. So obviously plenty of room for further growth in educational attainment. Here are Vietnamese data on what happens to kids as they move through school. So the horizontal axis here is age from 5 through 25. Vertical axis is the percentage of the age group actually in school for corresponding to their age grade. And what you see, if you look at just the red line, that's the line for all income groups in Vietnam, is that at the age of 12, nearly everyone is still in school. More than 90% of kids are still in school. But by the time we get to 18, only about less than 50% of Vietnamese kids are completing high school. And you can see that the rate of drop-off is really, really sharp. So basically, after the age of 12, kids start to disappear from the education system, and they do so at an accelerating rate. And it's not surprising, of course, that most of that disappearance takes place among low-income kids. That's the green line. The gap between high and low income from 12, that's the end of primary school, to 18, approximately the end of high school, opens up from about 10 or 12 percentage points difference in enrollment rate to about more than 50% difference. So we know this stuff. This is, I think, familiar from lots of cases, but a particularly stark example of this in Vietnam. So the problem I want to frame in the following way. An economist, of course, has to talk about costs and benefits. That's what I'm going to do. And then what I'm going to say is that independent of the idea of education as a merit good, as a good thing in its own right, and independent even of improvements in the supply of schooling, we also need to think about the demand for schooling from the perspective of households and children. What am I going to get from my investment in education? Okay, I get some non-monetary benefits, and those are very, very important, but I also need to think about the monetary or the financial benefits over my lifetime from an educational investment. And international data suggests that the average rate of return across lots and lots of different countries, around about 10% per year of schooling. We should see that kind of number improving with economic growth, because as countries develop, then skill-intensive activities, skill-intensive industries, typically grow faster than other industries in the economy. If that's the case, then the demand for skilled workers should also be growing faster than the average for the economy as a whole. That's what we expect to see. And then it's kind of a puzzle, a paradox, that in both Vietnam and Indonesia, we don't see as much of this as we would expect. Indeed, average returns to schooling as calculated in quite a lot of different studies in both countries are quite low by international standards, and there is even some evidence that in the last 10 years or so they have fallen. Let me show you what I mean. These are Indonesia data for different levels of schooling, from primary through lower secondary, vocational and general upper secondary, college and university. And the height of the bar is the estimated average returns to schooling per year of schooling at each level. These are Indonesian data from 1993 in blue and 2007 in red. So a very big gap between the two. But what I want to point out first is that 10% international benchmark, that's up here. That's very rarely reached at any level of schooling, either for males or for females in Indonesia. And furthermore, if you look at the red bars compared with the blue ones, then there is some suggestion, at least, that returns have not improved in Indonesia. So in terms of incentives to invest in education, if these numbers are accurate, then they suggest that the decision to invest in more schooling for more Indonesians may be a difficult one for individuals and households, because the economic returns don't look very strong. Same in Vietnam. These numbers here now go through time from 1998 to 2014. Red and blue dots, different estimation methods, but essentially the same story. And these ones show estimated returns to a year of education peaking in 2008 and then declining by about 40% over the next 6 years. If these estimates are accurate, then that's a very serious problem, because that is saying to kids, well, if you invest more in school, the return on your investment may not be as great as you expected it. And that's an issue for the demand for education. So why might this be happening? We heard already the name Lant Pritchett mentioned. He's a great economist to read, because when Lant Pritchett writes stuff, he writes technical economics for general audiences, and it's really easy to understand and also very deep at the same time. So he's one of my favorite economists to read. Lant Pritchett, great guy. And in 2001, he had a really nice article called "Where Did All the Education Go?" Which said, well, if returns to education don't seem to measure up, why might that be? And here's his three hypotheses. The first one is that a lot of educated kids go into activities in highly corrupt countries that are not counted in GDP, and so they're kind of lost to the system in some sense. They go into activities that are not contributing to economic growth, so we're not measuring the returns to their education accurately. Second, the familiar problem of poor quality schools or under provision of schools and teachers, and that means that years of schooling may not correlate very well with productivity, because the kids who are good, well, they're going to do well anyway, independent of what the school offers them, because their parents can pay for additional education and tutoring and things like that. And the kids who are not very good aren't going to get very much benefit from schooling, because the schools are not very good. So that's his second idea. Third one is, of course, economists have to talk about the invisible hand. So the third one is the market for education. And educational returns might be low or might decline if the supply of skills, that is, the supply of graduates from high school and tertiary education, actually exceeds the growth in demand for those skills. So I want to investigate this third point now. And I want to do it in a moment with some numbers. But let's think about the first 2 points very quickly. If you take a standard measure of corruption, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, Vietnam and Indonesia are improving on that. So probably this first idea of piracy is not a good way to explain trends in educational attainment in Vietnam or Indonesia. Second, we know that the quality of schools in Indonesia and Vietnam could be much better, but it certainly hasn't got worse in the last couple of decades, so we don't think that's the story either. But I do think that we need to look much more closely at the question of supply and demand. The supply of skills has grown, as we'll see in a moment. Has it grown faster than demand, and is that what's pushing down the returns to educational investments? So look first at the bottom part of this slide. Here's just a little back of the envelope calculation. So Indonesia's per capita economic growth rate last 15 or so years, about 5.5% per year. Vietnam a little bit faster, 6.5% approximately. So if the economy is growing in a uniform way, every activity is expanding at that rate, then the demand for skills is also expanding at about 5.5 or 6.5%. We have to take account of the fact that there are around 40 years of productive activity in the workforce, so every year at least 2% of workers are lost through retirement or other forms of attrition. Add that to the 5.5 or 6.5%, and then it says that balanced growth, an economy which is expanding without changing shape, structure, is going to have an annual growth of demand for skills at around 7.5 to 8.5% in Indonesia or Vietnam, respectively. And because that's balanced growth, and we expect that actually economic growth increases demand for skills faster than the average growth rate of the economy, we should think of this as the lower bound growth rate of the demand for skills. Now look at the top of at the table at the top here. If our benchmark is around 7.5, 8.5% growth rate of the supply of the demand for skills each year, that's the minimum we expect. Now look at the growth of supply, especially 2005 to 2010, the last period for which we have internationally comparable data. And you can see that these numbers, these growth rates for secondary and tertiary, Vietnam and Indonesia, are not much higher for secondary and are lower or approximately lower for tertiary. So it doesn't look like the story about just supply exceeding demand in terms of balanced growth is going to explain declining returns to educational investments. I want to turn our attention then to another set of stories, and these are macroeconomic stories, and they're different for each of the two countries, but interestingly, they have kind of convergent implications. And that is change in the structure of the economy in a way that favors the growth of less skill-intensive industries and correspondingly penalizes the growth of more skill-intensive industries. So not balanced growth, but actually a pattern of growth which has kind of worked in the unexpected direction of having faster growth in low-skill in industries than in high-skill industries. Maybe that's contributing to lower returns to education in these two countries. Now, different stories, but some common elements. Thank you. In both rapid economic growth, so we're not talking about countries like Latin America undergoing sort of catastrophic adjustment. This is a very different story indeed. But lots and lots of new growth in low-skilled service sectors like trade and transport, construction, personal services, areas of the economy where formal training isn't rewarded by higher wages. What is rewarded is your native ability to think on your feet and do well, but not credentials that you get from school. And then on top of that, we've had in Indonesia a major boom in exports of natural resources, which has undermined the growth of relatively skill-intensive industries like manufacturing. In Vietnam, by contrast, and again paradoxically, major growth in low-skill manufacturing activities, which has pulled people out of agriculture, but again, doesn't demand anything beyond ninth grade, and even ninth grade, not so sure, in terms of educational credentials. So these are economies whose recent growth has been dominated, first of all, by tradable sectors. In Indonesia, resources. In Vietnam, low-skill manufacturing. Those sectors don't require a lot of education. And then, in addition to those, a lot of growth in the service sectors that come along with them, and those sectors also don't require a lot of skills. Very quickly, the structural change story in Vietnam, driven a lot by foreign direct investment. Vietnam's accession to the WTO in 2007. The presence of foreign invested firms in Vietnam is quantitatively associated with earlier exit from school by Vietnamese children at a provincial level. Talk about that more in the Q&A if you want. In Indonesia, the resource export boom in the early part of the 21st century saw the growth rate of manufacturing jobs collapse from its 1990s rate of about 6% one of the highest growth rates of jobs across sectors, down to only 0.9%. Fastest rates of job growth in Indonesia in the early part of the 21st century were in mostly low-skill, at least the big industries that grew fast were low-skill industries. So here we have a structural change story which appears to be driving a message to children, which is you're the most likely place in which you're going to get a job is an industry where skills are not necessarily rewarded very highly. Therefore, you have to think carefully about staying at school any longer than the age 15, right? And this is what poses a real constraint to moving from universal primary education to universal secondary education in these rapidly growing but rapidly changing countries. I have very little time left, but I want to talk briefly about inequality because these two things interact in a very important way. If you really want to get universal secondary education, you've got to do something about inequality because poor people and disadvantaged people are the ones you have to catch in the system in order to achieve universal gains. Right? That's not going to be so easy. Very, very quickly, we can talk about different dimensions of inequality. Let me concentrate only on the first one, which is household income. These are on the left and on the right. 2004 school enrollment rates for Vietnamese kids. Left side, the poorest 20% of the population by income. Right side, the richest 20%. And you can see that, of course, wealthy kids stay in school. They have higher enrollment rates, that is, much higher engagement with school here. And then a lot more of them go to tertiary education. So that's the 2004 sort of pre-economic boom thing. And then 2012, the black outline shows us the 2004 data. And we can see that there's been a huge improvement in school retention and tertiary enrollment for the kids on the rich side of the spectrum. And we'll look what's happened on the poor side. Massive economic growth, lots and lots of low-skilled jobs available. Good jobs, but low-skilled jobs. And we see actually a retreat in terms of school persistence in the lowest 20% of the population. Really surprising, really counterintuitive kind of data. Okay. Could do the same for ethnicity, but I don't have time. What I could also do the same for institutions, but I don't have time for that either. So let me just wrap up and try to finish on time. What matters in the interaction between inequality and the change in economic structure that I've described is that if you have a bad start in life because your parents are poor or you live in a bad area, a remote area with poor schools, as you all know, then you start off on a back foot in terms of education. And the inequality dynamics are that inequality among children then increases all the way through the schooling system and into their working lives, because if you get a bad start in school, then you don't do very well in school, and then teachers and also your own parents may invest less in your education. That means you're more likely to exit early into the labor market, and if you do that, you're going to get lower wages, lower lifetime earnings, and you will transmit that to your children, right? They will also have a bad start in life relative to other kids who had a different experience. So these disadvantages are dynamic disadvantages, and that circle has to be broken if we're going to achieve real progress in moving poor kids, especially poor kids or disadvantaged kids, through beyond 12 years or 15 years age dropout from the school system. So it requires a very big change in educational policy, but it also requires thinking about a much broader strategy, because if I'm right that changes in the structure of the economy have really disadvantaged kids from staying in school, or has discouraged the marginal child from staying in school, then we have to think in an integrated way about how the economy is growing, what that means for the growth in the demand for skills, and then integrate that with policies that are directed at the supply of education, especially that part which addresses poor or disadvantaged children. So, last slide. If we think about this middle income challenge for developing countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, achieving the SDG education goal means both deepening and broadening education. More years of schooling per child and more children getting more years of schooling. Currently, most of the emphasis in this area is on improving the supply of education through better schools, better teachers, more teachers. Those are really important. And addressing inequality and opportunity, access to schools, really important. Very, very important things. But what if demand failures are really preventing kids, even with access to such facilities, from deciding to stay in school because they expect that that investment will not be rewarded? In that case, we really do have to think about supply side and also demand side of the educational system. And that's a somewhat provocative statement that I want to leave you with. Let me emphasize, however, that this is work in progress. So I'm very interested in your feedback on this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian, for a very, very interesting presentation. And in fact, you introduced the so-called demand responsive approach that I'm also going to talk tomorrow. Wonderful. Right, so not only supply side that matters, but also demand. Exactly, on the mark. Let's move on to Ibu Ronina Aziz, the presentation of which title is Inequality of Opportunities Among Ethnic Groups in the Philippines. The time is yours. Maximum, please, 20 minutes.
Okay, good morning. My presentation is just part of our bigger study entitled Inequality of Opportunities Among Ethnic Groups in the Philippines. This particular presentation, I will be focusing on education. The Philippines, as you may know, has more than 7,000 islands, a highly diverse society. Sorry. I thought, okay. The Philippines has more than 7,000 islands. It's a highly diverse society composed of 182 ethnic groups based on 2010 Census of Population and Housing. Poverty and inequality have been persistent problem faced by the Philippine society. Income distribution in the Philippines as shown by various inequality measures such as Gini coefficient, share bottom of 20%, and there's a dispersion ratio, has not improved significantly from 1991 to 2015. In other words, the gap between the rich and poor Filipinos in terms of income has not narrowed much more than 2 decades. There has been very little work that examine inequality in terms of non-income indicators like education, and that look at the situation of different ethnic groups in the Philippines. Thus, the objective of our study, particularly in this presentation, is to examine inequality of educational opportunity among ethnic groups in the Philippines. Our goal is to provide insights on how to address such inequalities. Going to the methodology, the data that we use are 2000 and 2010 Census of Population and Housing, conducted by Philippine Statistics Authority. The data for the 10 and 20% sample of the 2000 and 2000 CPH respectively were used in this study because only these samples have data on socioeconomic attributes. For the variables, we have the years of schooling, literacy status, access to primary and secondary education. Years of schooling is the average years of schooling of population aged 25 and over. Literacy rate is the proportion of population aged 10 and over who can both read and write a simple message. Access to primary and secondary education were limited to population aged 6 to 11 and 12 to 18 respectively. We used ethnicity as the grouping variables. The inequality measures used for the estimation are the Gini coefficient, TILES index, and human opportunity index. Gini coefficient and TILES index are the most common measure both for within and within group inequalities. These measures use years of schooling and literacy rate variables. Human Opportunity Index, however, is between group inequality measure. This is developed by the World Bank that use access to primary and secondary education variables. For all the estimation, we use the ADU packages from Stata software. namely INECDECO, GINIDES, and HOI. To define the ethnicity, ethnicity is the primary sense of belongings to an ethno-linguistic group, which is blood-related in nature in the sense that the ties are reckoned by blood traced through family trees, based on the Philippine Statistical Authority. The Philippines, as I mentioned earlier, has a total of 182 ethnic groups, more than 100 of which are considered indigenous people identified by the National Commission on Indigenous People. Since there are 100 ethnic groups reported in the census of population, we use the major grouping based on the classification by the NCIP. The three major ethnic groups are the Muslim ethnic groups, non-Muslim IPs ethnic groups, and the non-Muslim non-IB ethnic groups. Here are the 182 groups. Muslim ethnic group has two subgroups, Muslim IP subgroup and Muslim non-IP subgroup. According to the NCIP, the Muslim IP groups are those that embrace the Islamic faith and at the same time continue to practice their own culture and tradition as IPs. While Muslim non-IP groups are not classified as IPs by Office of Muslim Affairs, but profess the Islamic faith. The non-Muslim IP ethnic group are officially classified by the NCIP as IPs. The Muslim non-IP ethnic group are those that are either Muslim IP groups or non-IP groups. Actually, we did estimation for the 182 groups, but it was difficult to come up with policy recommendation. That's why we use the NCIP groupings. Going to the key findings, majority of Filipinos are neither Muslim nor IPs, accounting for around 86% of total population. The second largest group is the non-Muslim IB ethnic group, comprising approximately 9% of total population, while the smallest group is the Muslim ethnic group, which accounts only for 6%. The non-Muslim non-IPs are scattered all over the country, which is represented by the map in the middle. And Muslim ethnic groups are found mostly in autonomous region, in Muslim Mindanao or ARM, and other Mindanao region as well as Palawan. It's represented by the last map, the third map. The Muslim IP are found in Caldera Administrative Region or CAR, other Muslim areas in the north, and lowland forest and coastal area in the south. It's represented by the first map. Before I present to you the main result, let me first give you a snapshot of Philippine educational system. With the adoption of the K-12 basic education curriculum starting 2012, students are now required to spend an additional of 2 years for a total of 12 years before they can enter tertiary level. The secondary level is now divided into 4 years of junior high and 2 years of senior high school, both of which are technical vocational courses. Okay, let me now present to you our inequality estimates. This table shows the decomposition inequality measure in terms of education. If you look at the total inequality, both for years of schooling, the literacy, both for years of school and literacy, went down from 2000 to 2010. These findings suggest that the gap among the best off and worst off ethnic groups in terms of years in schooling and literacy rate had narrowed during the said period. As shown in this slide, average years of schooling of population aged 25 and over, as well as literacy of those aged 10 and over, generally improved from 2000 to 2010. Years of schooling increased by 1 year on an average, while literacy rate increased by 5 percentage points. Looking back to this table, if we look at the composition, we can see that both years of schooling and literacy the within group component had largely contributed to the total inequality. For example, the ties index, the total is 1.1382, and then the between group is 0.0036, and the within group is 0.1346. This means that the variation within major ethnic groups rather than between groups had been the main source of inequality. The within group inequality also improved from 2000 to 2010. This implies that there had been improvements in the provision of basic education services in general. We can also observe that between group inequality in terms of literacy had marginally improved, while the between group inequality in terms of years of schooling had worsened a bit. Given the changes in both components, the within group inequality still had the bigger share to total inequality. Given that within group inequality got the bigger share to total inequality, it is thus sensible to look at the subgroup indices or inequality among the subgroups within each of the major ethnic groups. What we can observe from this table is that Muslim ethnic group had been the worst off and has had highest inequality both in terms of years of schooling and literacy, both in 2000 and 2010. In fact, based on the rule of thumb of Gini coefficient by Binion and Link 1998, if 0.4 or higher is considered too large, that's why there has been a highly inequality distribution in terms of education among the Muslim. Among these Muslim ethnic groups, we can observe that in this slide that there are IP groups with more low educational outcome or only 2 years. Where is the pointer? The green one? Okay. This one. Okay. Or only 2 years of formal schooling and around 30% literacy rate. Like this the IP groups, Bajau, Sama Bajau, and Sama Laot. While there are non-IP groups here, it's very high educational outcomes at 7% or 7% years of formal schooling and 7 to 10 years of formal schooling and 90% literacy rate. In fact, Samalaot, Samabajau, and Bajau have the same origin. They have low educational outcome because they are considered as freelancers and are not forced to go to Islamic schools and to participate in economic activities. Acquiring an education is more an option for them, aside from the fact that they are originally located in conflict areas. Please note that the conflict area, more or less, is the primary cause of displacement of many ethnic groups, especially in Mindanao. On the other hand, Palawan have a higher access to education because in province of Palawan, there are many schools from primary to tertiary level. Meanwhile, Maranao belongs to the top 3 largest Muslim group and tend to have a higher access compared to smaller groups. Let us now look at the inequalities in terms of school participation. This slide shows that the Philippines is doing very well both in terms of provision and equitable distribution of primary education service to children aged 6 to 11 as evidenced by the high value of HOI. On the contrary, it has been a challenge for the Philippines to increase access to and ensure equitable distribution of secondary education service among population aged 12 to 18. This is the here. Among major ethnic group, the Muslim ethnic group had the least access to and least equitable distribution of education services, both primary and secondary. These findings in the previous slide are consistent with this official data on school attendance rate. School attendance rate of Filipino students aged to 6 to 11 generally had very high even before 2010, while school attendance rate of older cohort or older children aged 12 to 18 have been relatively lower, especially the age of 15. You see the drop here. One possible reason of this that secondary education is costlier, both in terms of direct costs such as fees and transportation, well as opportunity costs, because older children can already be sent to work to help augment their household income. Again, Muslim ethnic group had the lowest and most unequal access to both primary and secondary education. Okay, for the final slide, concluding remarks. Disparities in terms of years of schooling and literacy appear to be narrowing between 2000 and 2010, as shown by various inequality measures. Higher within group inequality exists among Muslim ethnic groups, while non-Muslim, non-IPs are generally better off in terms of years of schooling and literacy. Filipinos had higher access to and more equitable distribution of primary education services, while lower and less equal access in terms of secondary education services. The Philippine government had been exerting efforts to improve access of ethnic groups to education. Sample of the program is the IP education of the Department of Education, and another one is the IP component of modified conditional cash transfer or CCT program of Department of Social Welfare and Development. And other strategies might be considered is improving physical access to educational facilities like dorm. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting issue and also data and so on that you raise on accessibility, especially to secondary education, among the ethnic groups in the Philippines. And also thank you very much for keeping within the time, only 15 minutes presentation. And now let's move on to the discussions. May I invite the first discussion, Dr. Eun Mi Lim from UHA Women's University, Korea. And apparently all the presenters have moved to their respective seats, No, I think it's okay, So you will be better able to hear the discussion. Maybe you can use the clicker.
So it's kind of maybe 7 to 8 minutes. With the short height privilege, can I just sit in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
You need the mic. Yes. Okay, thank you very much for all the excellent presentations. For 4 presentations, the only 7 minutes is almost impossible. I mean, to talk about every presentation. My major comments, majority of my comments will go to the Dr. Ian Coxhead, because I find it very, very interesting, and then also have some questions. It's quite interesting. Often in our, because I'm a sociologist myself, and often we talk about this education and development. Often education, we regard the education as a independent variable, cause, and the development is more of an effect. But your argument is more like the other way. So it's especially the changes in the economic structure, how the changes in the economic structure affects the education attainment. But with all due respect, my question was, because of time limit, I wonder whether you have carefully looked at the gender dimensions of all this aspect, particularly, so let's say, for example, let's start with the case of Indonesia and Vietnam. Indonesia case, when I just looked at the UN report, and then the educational attainment, at least enrollment rate, is very similar. Interestingly, the Indonesian case, between male and women, and the secondary level is same. And also in majority of the countries, in developing countries, interestingly, there are more female enrollment in tertiary education. However, in terms of labor force participation, the female labor force participation with the higher education in the case are much lower. And so I know that I agree with you that this is this changes in the economic structure is very interesting cause. However, other causes that really affect women's and men's engagement in the labor market, particularly for a woman's case. Indonesia's case, the labor force participation of women is only 53%, when males participation 86%, when the educational attainment are similar, even higher for women. So how would you explain okay, and so another, so maybe like, employment also must be explained with other gender aspects like early marriage or marriage and other, maybe lack of job opportunity for women, but that also helps your argument about the industry nature of characters industry of Indonesia, like more heavily invest in this the sector, like talk about the natural resource extraction sectors, maybe. On the other hand, the Vietnamese case, the Vietnamese women's labor force participation is one of the highest in the world. And there's gender disparity is very, very small. And then still, the job opportunity, most of women are working in the sector is the manufacturing sector, like textile sectors. And so, given that, my question is, you talk about the demand side, industry changes. So industry demand low-skilled jobs, therefore, because of the low returns on education, might as well not go into school. Probably so. But on the other hand, according to, I did a little bit of study about related to this one in Vietnamese case, about the Tibet case, technical vocational education. So with some surveys done, the vocational training school actually is not really the markets. It's okay. How do I say? You said the market demands the low skills, but on the other hand, in the many business people that I interviewed and studied, actually people in the market, they want higher skills, and their complaint was they cannot find higher skilled workers, so they don't want to hire them because they are not really skilled and then okay qualified. Therefore, they blame the education system. Okay, and so how would you react? Okay, reply to that kind of questions. And then if I have time, I have a lot more questions, but after dinner or during the dinner. Okay. And then I also like to ask Professor the Toru Yaga Hihara. I can see your passion and all the excitement but because my ignorance in that area, it was amazing that you developed the analytical conceptual framework. I think it can be a very good, insightful sort of the information for the policy and practice. Okay, for the people in the field. So instead of asking you on your presentation, I wonder because you emphasize the more supply side of education importance, right? Is that correct? Because outreach program, so do we have to go to the people outreach? Even though you more focus on the micro side, but Dr. Ian Cox, and then you more focus on macro aspect. But still, I wonder how the Dr. Yanagihara, okay, will react to his, the Mr. Cox, okay, I'm sorry, your name is, Ian's, Ian's, the argument about the demand and the side. So maybe, okay. And then the doctor, your Dennison, okay, Dr. Dennison. And very interesting, and an urbanization always problem, because you said the government action was to include all the, everybody, no one's behind. But when I saw your statement, this is, it applies to all Malaysian citizens. So, but I understand, because from the last year's our conversation about the migration, there are a lot of migrant workers living in Malaysia is one of the most popular destinations. So so how this, your government, this plan, SDGs action and others will include, you say inclusivity is important, but it looks like they are excluded. At least. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. So how would you deal with these migrants and other ethnic groups, maybe if they are not Malaysians? And also, and also another, always a problem. My second question is, you said it's very difficult for the local government or the central government or local government people to empowering the people from, so always it's important to hear, pay attention to the voices from the field, particularly bottom 40%. So you came up with a conclusion, right? It's very important to empowering them. Actually, how would you do it? And then, and so the next, or the last one, I'll just leave it. So I think my time is up. Yeah.
Thank you very much, but we have ample time during lunch and dinner. We can have the discussion further. I would like to invite Dr. Marife Ballesteros from PIDS, Philippines. Thanks.
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning. It's still morning. First, I would like to thank our host for having me here, including Kaidek, of course. Well, that will come later. This is not really a comment to each of the paper, but more of a general perspective on the topic of the panel, which is inequality and how we try to address this. And from my end, I will try to look at provide some experience in the case of the Philippines and relate this to what has been presented. I think in general, we are all in agreement that most countries has already moved towards that concept of multidimensional poverty. And looking at inequality is, I think, a very good start for all of us, or a very good direction for all of us, because it provides us a broader view of what are the contributions or what are the sources of poverty and what are the most significant one. There are actually, as we have seen, there are actually different forms of inequality. And it could be economic, social, cultural, political. And sorry. Okay, wait. I'll try to recall what I have written so far, because apparently my computer has stopped working. Anyway, okay. So what I wanted to say is that in the case of in the case of the Philippines, for instance, what are the basic sources of inequality? And I think it is similar to other countries: access to education, access to land, for instance. In our case, we still have a very high land ownership concentration, a Gini ratio of 0.45, and this is despite programs or strategies like land reforms that try to address this issue. We have also issues on the access to housing, and we have seen a while ago that in terms of there is a relationship between housing conditions and health and actually education. But the housing, I think, aspect is related not only in terms of how many households have access to sanitation or water system, but there's also a spatial context. And I showed here a figure. We tried, especially for instance in urban areas, we look at the access to infrastructure and basic social services in a spatial context. And this was done by scholars from Japan, Nakamura in 2010. And if you look at the map, this is Metro Manila, and try to see where are the links of transportation, where are the major tertiary hospitals, we see that most of Metro Manila in the center are well connected through the LRT to the MRT, but in areas where you have a lot of informal settlements, and this is the urban area or the city, and there is a lot less accessibility or very low accessibility in these areas. And if you think about it, this is one of I think, strategies that we have to consider, because usually the public infrastructure to a large extent have been driven by private interests, because most of this infrastructure are actually financed through public-private partnership. And what you see are therefore accessibility within areas where there is a lot of business activity going on, and the issue of about accessibility of those in other areas are actually not being addressed. So that's in the case of access to housing. So the other areas of inequality, of course, education, and we have seen the similar thing, that you have a lot of dropouts in the case of secondary. We have higher participation rate in elementary, and then a decline in the dropout. And the similar factors that affect this decline or this less access or dropouts in this case of the secondary education actually is also happening in the case of the Philippines. And of course, there is also this inequality in terms of access to financing. And this is especially in the case of rural areas, where there is still a lot of households that has no access to microfinancing, and therefore most of operations in the rural sector is still being dominated by your operators or of the higher income group. So I think what I'm saying is that there are a lot of major areas of inequalities that we have to consider. And the question for all of us is what kind of strategies should we provide in order to address these inequalities. And I think I like the take of Professor Taru when he said that we look at what the evidences are saying. And like, for instance, in the case of education, we are, in the case of the Philippines, for instance, we are putting a lot of money on the feeding program. And if indeed the issue is not really the feeding the gut, but really it's an issue of the heart and the mind, then I probably we are not providing the right strategies. Secondly, in the case, for instance, of land inequality, it's not just the provision of land, because if you don't have access to financing, you don't have access to support, you don't have the right support services, then the tendency is that those who will operate your land is basically not itself those owners themselves, but actually those who have access to investments or financing. So I guess the Philippines, for instance, has a lot of programs trying to address poverty and inequality. But again, we try to assess each of the programs in terms of the impact and all that. But I guess it's very important to have this kind of conference where we're able to share experiences and we see what really works and what works and what will not work in terms of providing outreach to those who are really at the bottom poor. And one of the major challenges that we see is for government really to be able to balance private gains and social gains, so that we can bring in those really that are coming from the lower level. So I think I'll end with my comments on that.
Thank you very much for the comments. Maybe let's keep the comments and questions posed by the discussant first, yeah, because I want to give time to the participants who would like to raise questions to the particular presenters. And then I will give 10-15 minutes, yeah, before 12 to all the presenters to comments. So I open the floor from the participants who would like to raise questions. Maybe because of the time limit, 3, yeah? I'll limit to 3, Stephen, and then any other? Maybe we'll start with Steve, please.
Thank you.
And also to whom, yeah, you would like to address your question.
Thank you, everyone. Those very interesting presentations. I just had a question for Ian. You were arguing that the demand for schooling has gone down because of the rise of, in Indonesia, services, and in Vietnam, low-skill manufacturing, both of which increase the demand for low-skilled labor. So basically reduce the skill premium. Perhaps that's one way to think about it. But it seems very insightful, but don't you think that should have led to reduced inequality, because you're giving increased opportunities for those who are without education, yet we see inequality rising in both Vietnam and Indonesia? So how do you reconcile that? Thank you.
Any other who would like to pose questions to the presenters, aside from Stephen? If not, maybe let's start the other way around, yeah, from the list of the presenters. I would like to give the time to Dr. Ronina Aziz, yeah, to respond, yeah, to the discussions, and then Ian, Pak Denison, and last Pak Toru Yanagihara. Okay, please, the time is yours, Ibu Ronina Aziz. Yeah, maybe you would like to respond back to what the discussants have outlined. Yeah. If you have, or if you don't have anything to respond back, okay. And then maybe Ian, you have several questions. Yeah, I'm sure you already noted down. Okay.
So thank you very much. So I'm. Maybe I pressed it too many times. Okay. Yeah. So it's good to be right, but it's more important to be provocative. So I'm glad I got some questions. Unme, thank you for those comments. Very, very interesting reflections on what I had to say. Remember, work in progress. So let me just respond a little bit to what you said. I don't have all of the information that I need to answer you. You raised the question of gender differentials. You pointed out that it's often the case, and it's certainly the case in these data, that women actually get a higher educational investment than men, and especially at tertiary level, and yet they have much lower labour force participation rates. So why is that? And that's a question with I think, a very multifaceted answer. There's a lot of ways to answer that. I taught for several years at a university in Hanoi. I'd go and teach them macroeconomics 101 in 3 weeks. They loved it because, who wouldn't? And but the class was 90% women, 10% men every year. 50 in the class, 45 women, 5 men. And I asked them, why is this? And all of the women, with one voice, said, men are lazy. So maybe that's part of the answer. The boys just sat there. They didn't listen to the question, so they didn't have an answer. So maybe they're right. I think part of this is that education, especially for wealthy households, and Hanoi is a wealthy city in Vietnam, is a merit good. So parents invest in their children's education, not only but thinking about labour market returns, but thinking about many more dimensions of the investment that they're making. So I'm sure that's a very big part of it, but there's also more. Of course, labour force participation rates are lower for women everywhere, much less low in Vietnam, as you point out, but and that's also part of it.
The Vietnamese case is just, compared to other countries, women's labour participation is actually high.
It's very high,
But the
yeah.
Indonesian case, education level sounds like it's similar, probably better, but the labour force participation in the Indonesian case is huge gap.
Yeah,
So
not as big as other countries, but still a big gap. Yeah,
Lower, but I'm
yeah.
talking about the gaps.
Yes.
Compared to
Yeah.
other countries. So these countries, Vietnamese women's labor participation rate is quite high.
70-something%,
Yeah,
right?
something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Maybe it's 80s,
Yeah.
about 10% around the differences. But Indonesia, talking about 30% differences.
Let me say something else about these kinds of discrepancies. I'm going to punt on the gender question because I don't know enough about it. What I am going to say is that if you're looking for discrepancies, then the gender dimension is actually not the biggest one by far in either of these countries. The biggest one is the combination of ethnicity and poverty. In Vietnam, the ethnic minority population of Vietnam is 15% of the total population. And over the last 15 years, they've gone from accounting for about 30% of the poor population to about 70%. In other words, economic growth in Vietnam has been highly concentrated in the ethnic majority population, and we see that in every dimension of the data. That is a much bigger problem, I think, than the gender problem, but I'm, again, going to punt on that a little bit. Technical and vocational education, I think, is a really interesting thing, and that is absolutely part of the work in progress here. So both these two countries, Vietnam and Indonesia, have adopted very prescriptive, very top-down approaches to vocational education. In Indonesia, the policy, as I understand it, is to really encourage kids in secondary school to go to vocational high schools rather than general. Am I not too far wrong? No? Okay. I read that in articles by Indonesian economists, so I don't know. Certainly in Vietnam, there's been a very strong prescription on vocational education. The problem, and it's good if you're teaching specific skills, it's good. But in the case of an economy which is changing structure very fast, the question is, what kind of skills should we be teaching those kids in vocational school? Because if you teach them to be specialists in some sector and that sector goes away, then you've got a problem, right? And I think actually there's a gender dimension to this, which is that men given the choice, or boys given the choice in a vocational education system, will choose trades. They want to be mechanics or they want to do other things that are technical, and then they become very vulnerable to changes in the structure of skills demand. Whereas women typically choose options which are like clerical or managerial, which can actually go across many different industries. So if one industry goes away, another industry is going to grow and expand the demand for those skills. And you can see this in the Indonesian returns to schooling data, where the returns to men's investments in vocational schooling are very, very low and have fallen very far, relative, in absolute terms and relative to women. So I think there's an interesting story to explore there. Stephen, very quickly on inequality. Great question. Don't know. There are lots of things that are driving changes in inequality, of course. It is likely that smoothing out the set of opportunities in the labour market would help to reduce inequality, but it may not be the dominant force. We have an expert on Indonesian inequality in the room. Where is he? He was in the room. Arif? Oh, there he is. Yeah. And I guess we're going to hear more about this tomorrow, so good question. However, I would just say that in the case of both countries, a lot of the increase in inequality is, of course, being driven by the very top of the income distribution, right? Where you've got opportunities that, to capture wealth of one kind or another, either through access because you own resources, or in the case of Vietnam, because you have access to government jobs which are highly paid and highly rationed, right? And those things can, I think, contribute a lot to inequality, but they don't apply to the population at large. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay. There were the commentator, Dr. Yoon Mi Lin, raised two questions, and Ibu Amida, in your comment, as I said, made intervention. So I thought I will take the liberty to respond to three issues. So I think I'll start with what Ibu raised when I sat down, that the income level in the Malaysian society, because it's actually moving to develop status. So situation of Malaysia, Singapore has to be compared with South Korea, Taiwan, in terms of the poverty figures, moving from basket of goods measurement to mean or medium measurements that's coming out. So I didn't have time to look at the macro data and other things in looking at multidimensional poverty like income, housing, health, education, nutrition, employment. Then one would see those at the bottom 40% are actually living in neighborhoods or in jobs which are very different from the middle and the more affluent sections of Malaysian society. So it seems high when you look at comparisons, but what we have found in field visits and interaction, the experience of deprivation might be, is almost similar, if not worse, for someone in urban flats as opposed to someone in the forest, because they would have fresh air, they could go to the river, if unpolluted, they could get fish, or they could plant something or rear something, whereas someone on 21-story flats doesn't have any space for additional. So even at 3,000 ringgit now, most would criticize the government for low measurement of income and sort of things. Now, so that's an issue that will emerge. I think Japan, Korea, from what I got, was about 1,000 US a month, and below that you would be regarded poor. And when I visited Seoul, I went to places where people were living in one sort of room where you only got a bed, a small table, and then toilet was common. Food cooking was in a common community kitchen sort of themes. Now, the two comments raised, I think, is spot on. One is on citizens and non-citizens and the sort of Donald Trump syndrome in America actually creeps in. So Malaysia lives in a contradiction between the concept of the Nusantara, where we share the borders with the Malay archipelago of similar people moving around before colonial power came into being, and ASEAN as an ASEAN community and as a community 2025, yet within the country they would very much see this is Indon, this is Cambodian, this is Myanmar, they are not Malaysian sort of syndrome. For this, I think nation state, nationalism, politics interplay, where public funds is only to be used for citizens. And so the scenario comes, you got migrant workers, illegal migrant workers, we have refugees like Rohingya, Sri Lankan Tamil, then you have undocumented. Sabah has a lot from either Indonesia or southern Philippines. Now, there is a group that has emerged over the years and they have become adult, is actually people intermarry with citizens or they have been born in the country and they won't have access to schooling, healthcare, and other things. They will have to pay for it, but they don't have the access. So community schools have started, especially in Sabah. So you got Lahad Dato, where people are living still, and that I didn't cover, living on top of water, bad sanitation, security, other sorts. There are labor laws. ASEAN has worked on bilateral, multilateral issues on protection. But Malaysia is not a signatory to any of the labor-related declaration on migrant rights or conventions on refugee and other things. Although on the Rohingya issue, we have played a key role. So we are faced with the development paradigm that is an exploitative, greed, market-driven. I might sound Marxist, but I'm not. But that's the system in which there is a conflict between labor laws and home affairs, security laws, who gives the permit, who does the protection, does the worker have a right to file a complaint on his work, corruption, police arrest, picking up, RELA, all these are well documented. And so it's a massive issue. Inclusive development in the 11th plan is only for citizens. But we agreed to SDGs. We have presented our voluntary national report like Indonesia did, but non-citizens are not part of that report. And the SDG system is not rigorous enough. So we say no one left behind, but the indicators, measurement, the scrutiny is not there. It's more best practices and people present. I've been twice to the high-level political forum. It's a good sideshow, roadshow. Everybody is showing off, but the critical agenda is not coming out. Side events do. It's nothing like the universal periodical review or special rapporteurs and things of that sort. So maybe there's a place for academicians to take on these with the right indicators and compare if the SDGs is the framework we want to assess. Secondly, in terms of empowerment of the grassroots, I already said, I think we're very much different from Indonesian politics, where there is lots more of empowerment. Malaysia decided at one point that it will stop local government elections. So no mayor is elected, no official sitting in local authority is an elected official. You got members of parliament and all. Ground level, there isn't. So one I would feel which is needed is local government elections, but there isn't enough call for it, and part of it is ethnic dimensions, composition, who will capture the cities, who will become the mayors if it's open election. But that's another forum. Second, I think the government needs to create formal mechanisms, and they're not doing it. So at the ground, you got so many actors who try to control and influence between political, religious, neighborhood, and of course, in many of these areas, the real people who control the neighborhood is the informal, actually gangs that control. But they would be quite dignified now in its approach. Okay, so formal mechanisms need, like the Panchayat system, I think Philippines very much more stronger. Agencies need to go to the ground. I don't know how Korea does it or this comparative. So we are faced with urbanization, high rise. Singapore has a better model. And in terms of people's engagement, we would say we are having it, but it's not participatory, it's not ground level, it's a lot of tokenism. And the danger of SDG is window dressing and tokenism. While the cliches are good, I think ESCAP in its work, as well as the high-level political forum, is trying to define the quality of engagement. The power relations is not strong enough. So big businesses, political parties, bureaucracy control. People then there is grievance and uprising and possibly, hopefully, not leading to violence and terrorism. But hopefully, through the system of engagement, grassroots voices can be heard, and academicians, I believe, can play that public policy advocacy with objective analysis or even qualitative storytelling. Thank you very much.
Let me first respond to one specific comment from Dr. Yu Min Lin. The contexts are different. Ian's context is that of labor market, demand and supply. My context is social service, demand and supply. But more importantly, in the context of social service, we economists have the habit of using the term demand without pausing a moment. But psychologically, being able to demand is quite something, okay? And politically, possibly. So in the context of social services, you have to be careful with the use of the language. And let me read out one sentence in my paper in the introduction. In fact, and sort of referring to what I call user or potential user side of the service. In fact, in many cases, the most important private actors may be service users themselves. So that's my specific response to specific commentary. And let me use my minus 30 seconds. And I really would like to believe I have warm heart. But somehow at this moment, at this place, my cool head dominates. And the question to me is, do we take every single word, every single phrase, every single goal, whatever, seriously? SDG document, 2030 declaration document, do we take each and every word and phrase and goals and targets seriously? Or do we exercise our own judgment? Okay? I do exercise my own judgment. And I accept some part of the declaration, some part of the targets, goals and targets, and I don't do so on some other parts. Okay? Based on my cool head judgment. My warm heart sympathizes with all the sentiments expressed, wishes expressed, hopes expressed. But my cool head take exception. And this sort of goes, similar sentiment, cool head judgment or attitude applies to what I might tempted to call education fundamentalism. Is education sacrosanct? Okay? In Ian's case, obviously women, not women, necessarily women, low-income families have made their own judgment. And you can make the case that they could be myopic. Therefore, their decision go against their own long-term best interests. But that's one argument you can make. But simply looking at the SDG goal and what they are doing is going into the opposite direction of the goal, I don't think that's a basis for cool head judgment in my mind. Thank you very much.
I think we are right on time, 12 o'clock, amazingly. Amazingly. So thank you very much for all the excellent presenters, all four of you, Professor Toru Yanagihara, Pak Denison Jayasuriya, Professor Denison Jayasuriya, Professor Ian Coxhead, as well as Dr. Ronina Aziz, and the discussants, Dr. Yun Mi Lim and Dr. Marife Balesteros, and also participation from all the audience. I'm not going to make a summary or a conclusion of this session, because we're still going to have another session later this afternoon, and then also another session tomorrow. Maybe at the end of our symposium, we are going to have a comprehensive conclusion of all the issues being raised. But at least in our session, we focus, all the presenters focus on the poor, so-called bottom, while in the Malaysian case, 40%. Also focus on the education, the importance of the education, human resources development. Focus on the inequality of opportunity, especially among the various segments of the communities. And what I really like of this session is there are new ideas, new thinking, new thoughts. Some are still have to be tested, of course, a work in progress, as Ian said. But really, new thoughts, new ideas, also lessons learned from several of the countries. So this is a really good session, and for that, please give a big round of applause to the presenters and discussants. Now, and maybe some announcement, from Pak Arif.
Thank you, Bu Armida. Okay, so now it's a lunch time, so we were going to have lunch in a local restaurant. So it's a Sundanese restaurant. Sundanese is an ethnic of the West Java province. West Java has around 40 million population, and then majority of the population coming from the Sundanese ethnic background. So we're going to have a Sundanese food this time. So it's walking distance, but we're not going to walk. So there is a bus of Unpad that's waiting for you outside. You can. Oh yeah, please just go ahead. We'll wait for you. Don't worry. Yes, I think the bag we can leave. The bag, our people will be here to watch the bag. So, so you can leave the bag, or even if you take your bag is okay too. But leaving the bag is more than fine. So let's have lunch together.